To all our panelists, I'd invite you to take a seat up front. There's more space up front here. Please make yourselves comfortable. Wonderful. Nisam Bolvinaka to all our friends joining virtually from around the world. We hope you're able to see us or at least hear us. Bolvinaka to everyone who is here in person. Thank you for traveling this way to join us in this space. We are gathered here today on the homelands of the Lenape peoples who, due to centuries of colonialism perpetuated by genocide, forced displacement, and systemic oppression, are dispersed throughout the United States and Canada. We honor the current, past, and future generations of the Lenape people and their inherent wisdom and roles as stewards of these lands. As settlers and visitors to this land, we affirm their leadership and their presence. My name is Salah Tisongo, and I'm the Director of Advocacy with the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, an organization that advances human rights and social justice by partnering with those confronted by oppression and injustice. UUSC is very privileged to be in partnership with the Pacific Island students fighting climate change, who is the leading organizer for this side event. We'd also like to acknowledge the Alliance for Climate Justice Advisory Opinion, who is also co-leading this event with us. The title for this side event is Sailing for Climate Justice, a multi-stakeholder perspective on the campaign for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on climate change. The campaign began in 2019 when 27 law students gathered in a University of the South Pacific class on environmental law and decided to write letters to their leaders requesting their support on an initiative that would tie climate change and human rights to the world's highest court, to the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion Campaign, or ICJAO campaign, seeks to clarify the obligations of states to protect the rights of current and future generations from the adverse effects of climate change. And core to what the campaign seeks to advance are the principles of climate justice, intergenerational equity, and human rights. Since 2019, the campaign has grown. In September 2021, the government of Vanuatu announced its intention to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ, which then made it to the agenda of the 77th UN General Assembly meeting, where it'll be tabled for a vote. And that's just happening down the street, folks. Earlier this year, the campaign saw the support of the Caribbean community, the Organization of African, Caribbean, and Pacific States, and the Pacific Islands Forum, building the momentum for the vote at the 77th session. A global alliance for climate justice advisory opinion has also formed to support the campaign, which comprises more than 1,500 civil society organizations from across the world. I think that we can all agree that from a small seed that was planted in a classroom on an island far, far away from here, that it's truly amazing to see where this is today. This journey is symbolic of a waka. You will notice on the flyer for this event, a traditional Pacific canoe that is called a waka, to symbolize the journey of the campaign to seek an advisory opinion from the ICJ from a classroom in the Pacific Islands to the UN General Assembly here in New York and onwards to the ICJ in the Netherlands, where the journey to advance climate justice, intergenerational equity, and human rights will really begin. The waka is an integral part of Pacific culture and forms an intimate connection between people, communities, land and islands, and the ocean. Our ancestors sailed the seas with a waka, relying on their traditional wisdom and skills to traverse vast oceans, which, as we know, can be calm and tumultuous at the same time, with uncertain risks and dangers, and yet they survived and thrived. The vaca is also a source of sustenance, a symbol of empowerment. And so it is only befitting that the vaca symbolize this journey, the journey to take the world's biggest crisis to the world's highest court. We'd now like to invite you to watch a short video by the world's Youth for Climate Justice that captures their reason and hope for the campaign.
In every year of the last decade, our world has seen greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise and shatter records. But those responsible for burning the most fossil fuels have not experienced the most direct consequences of climate change. It has been us. The hundreds of millions of people living on the front line of the climate crisis. If global temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees Celsius in my lifetime, countries like mine will vanish beneath the waves. I will be forced to leave the land where my ancestors are buried, and to tell my children they have nowhere to call home. At Rio de Janeiro, Kyoto, and later at Paris, we were promised action. But despite ever more opportunities to address this crisis, the planet is hurtling towards climate catastrophe. Existing international agreements have not provided countries with legal clarity on their responsibilities to reduce emissions, leading to inaction. To break the impasse, the UN General Assembly must request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. All it would take is a simple majority vote from UN member states. An advisory opinion is not legally binding, but carries great legal and moral authority, encouraging all nations to protect the human rights of people affected by climate change. An opinion from the highest court in the world would also help to build a critical global coalition uniting governments and international institutions, and would define exactly what existing bodies of laws nations should follow. In the past, advisory opinions have been instrumental in establishing international laws on the right to self-determination, the prevention of genocide, and nuclear disarmament. We believe it could do the same for climate change. A planet in crisis doesn't have to be our future. If there is power in the world to save humanity from environmental disaster, it is the power of the people. Time is running out, and we have to act now. Please visit our website to join us.
It is now my honor to invite the Honorable Arnold Keel Lofman, the Attorney General for the Republic of Vanuatu, to provide his keynote address.
Thank you, Dumas. My name is Arnold Keel Lofman. I'm the Attorney General of the Republic of Vanuatu. First, I would like to convey my gratitude to the civil society for organizing this event. In particular, the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee have been very generous in helping to arrange this venue, as well as assisting with other logistical matters for which we're very grateful. I am honored to be speaking here today about globally significant initiative being led by Vanuatu. Our proposal for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change. I will allow our other distinguished speakers to tell you about the significance of the International Court of Justice advisory opinion. By the time our panel has been speaking, I know that everyone attending will know why we are seeking, we're taking this option. And why taking this option and how it will assist not just us in Vanuatu or the Pacific, but the whole world. My brief remark will instead focus on explaining how we arrived at this point in acknowledging those most closely involved in our success as far and noting some important milestones that we have passed as well as those soon to arrive. Exactly 1 year ago today, our Prime Minister announced that Vanuatu would be leading a campaign for an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. This we have done, and I am very pleased to say that the world is now taking notice. Then in June, the Organization for African, Caribbean and the Pacific States at the 14th session of the Council of Ministers endorsed Vanuatu's proposal. And more recently in July, the 51st meeting of the Pacific Island Forum leaders called on the UN General Assembly for a resolution requesting the International Court of Justice to provide an advisory opinion on the obligation of states under the international law to protect the rights of present and future generations against the adverse impact of climate change. In all, 81 UN member states have, through the regional representative bodies, indicated support for an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. Our work as a whole of government team, inspired and supported by civil society, has taken us a long way towards achieving our goal. We are proud of what we have done thus far, even though the most important few months lie ahead of us. I would like especially to recognize and acknowledge the outstanding work of our permanent representative, Ambassador Mr. Odo Devi, and the staff here in New York. You will hear from one of the ambassador's staff, Kevin Chan, shortly. Very importantly, I must also acknowledge the original driving force behind this campaign. The leaders of the Vanuatu Climate Action Network and the Pacific Island students who first brought their idea, their dream of taking the world's biggest problem to the world's highest court, to the Pacific leaders at the 2019 Pacific Islands Forum meeting. As we say in Vanuatu, one big fella thank you to us, to the Vanuatu and Pacific civil society organizations that are now united behind Vanuatu government ICJ campaign. Now, Oxfam has joined the alliance, and I am looking forward to hearing from the esteemed speaker from Oxfam a little later on today. This initiative has come a very long way from a low class at the Vanuatu Semalus campus of the University of the South Pacific all the way here to New York and soon the headquarters of the United Nations. Just a few days ago, the civil society activists took canoe and sailing boats onto the East River to make their calls for climate justice heard, loud and clear by the leaders and diplomats from around the world who are meeting at the UN headquarters. And then they sail on to the Statue of Liberty. Looking at photos of that public demonstration, I see that the Civil Society Alliance have chosen a new Vanuatu sand drawing in the design of a traditional Pacific foraging craft as their logo and theme. Sand drawing is an ancient art unique to Vanuatu that was in 2008 included at UNESCO representative list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The drawings are made directly on the ground, in the sand, or volcanic ash, or clay, using one finger the drawer traces a graceful composition of geometric patterns. This is not merely a unique artistic tradition. It developed as a means of communication among the members of some 80 different language groups of the central and northern islands of Vanuatu. A vital rule in sand drawing is that once the artist's finger first touches the ground, it cannot be lifted away until the drawing is completed. The campaign for ICJ advisory opinion on climate change is in this way like an incomplete sand drawing. We have our collective finger in the sand and we are partway through our task, and we will not hold or pause our efforts until we have completed what we started. And when it is finished, this will be a global sand drawing that will communicate a message to all of humanity that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis, and there is a moral and legal duty to protect the rights of the vulnerable, the unheard, forgotten, and more importantly, our succeeding generation. Traditional navigation is another appropriate symbol for our ICJ advisory opinion campaign. For thousands of years, Pacific peoples led the world in navigating across vast expanses of the ocean. With only their knowledge of the stars, the winds, and the currents, and the waters to guide them. Climate change now threatens even this. You all know how climate change wreaks havoc by causing cyclones and typhoons, droughts and wildfires and rising seas. In 2015, a single cyclone Pam, caused damage costing as much as 64.1% of Vanuatu's GDP. And that damage was caused in a matter of hours. You all know, but perhaps you have not considered how climate change is impacting us in thousands of less obvious ways. For our navigators and canoe builders, the changing climate means that even the winds and currents and waves are changing. Our traditional knowledge is interrelated with our land and seas, and even this climate change is threatening to take this away. But we in Vanuatu will not be passive victims. We will do everything we can to defend the human rights of our people, their right to food, to clean water, to safe housing from every threat, including one like climate change, to which we ourselves have contributed so little. We welcome and are greatly heartened by the resolution of the General Assembly, overwhelming majority adopted on July 28, recognizing that the clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a universal human right. Commencing soon, there will be rounds of informal negotiations at the ICJ for the ICJ advisory opinion. It is at this time that we will publicly release the draft questions that we are recommending the UNGA to ask the court. These negotiations will begin by October and a vital part of the diplomatic process. In November, a strong Vanuatu delegation will attend the 27th conference of the parties to the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement at Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. We are coming to the COP after having in August submitted the world's most comprehensive and ambitious national determined contribution. In this way as well, Vanuatu, with the support of like-minded states, is leading in the ambition and action in battling against climate change. At COP27, we will be asking the world for two things. Firstly, to match and find our NDCs, and secondly, to support our campaign for an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. And we therefore at the United Nations General Assembly. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my remarks for today. Thank you very much for your attention. And as in Vanuatu, we would like to say thank you, Thomas. Thank you.
Honorable Luffman, and thank you for reminding us that this campaign will not only support the people in the Pacific, but it'll serve the rest of the world. And we are heartened with your perspective that the world is taking notice of this campaign. One big fella Thomas to you, Honorable Luffman, to the mission of Vanuatu, to the people of Vanuatu, for carrying this work forward on behalf of us all. And we wish you knowledge and wisdom and strength and courage in the deliberations at the UN General Assembly at this session, and hope that the question that you will take to the ICJ will be as sharp and powerful as what you seek the advisory opinion to provide. So please join me in giving a round of applause for our honorable guest. Thank you. The Pacific Island Students Fighting for Climate Change have asked me to just provide some housekeeping guidance. I apologize for that. The bathroom is to the right of this hallway. Down here, there is water and a kitchen right over there as well. If you have any questions, please just feel free to come up and ask Vishal or my colleague Rachel and Mary Catherine sitting back there. So now we'll move on to the discussions. We are here to understand and hear from other perspectives about this campaign. So our panelists are seated here in front. I will now introduce each of them and invite you to come and provide your remarks and then take a seat in one of these chairs when you're done. For those joining virtually, please make use of the Q&A chat. Send your questions, your comments, your happy remarks or emojis via Zoom. We are all noticing that, and thank you. So I'd like to now introduce our first speaker. Kevin Chand is a Fijian international environmental lawyer based in New York, who currently serves as a legal advisor to the permanent mission of Vanuatu to the United Nations. In this capacity, Kevin supports Vanuatu's campaign to take climate change to the International Court of Justice. Welcome, Kevin. What are the motivations behind the government of Vanuatu's push for an ICJ-AO, and what would the government like to see achieved as a result of this campaign?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. To the organizers, it's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm a huge fan of PISFCC. I first met them last year at COP26. They're a very inspirational group. They come out from my alma mater, the University of the South Pacific, and it's really great to see big things coming out from the Pacific and led by the youth of the Pacific. In terms of answering the question, what are the motivations of Vanuatu to bring in an ICJ advisory opinion to the International Court of Justice? Oh, this is well, too close. I think this links to the origin story of PISFCC. In the Pacific, there's in Fiji, we call it Vanua. It's a principle that exists throughout the Pacific in different fora, in different forms, and it talks to the connection between humans and the connection to the land, the ocean, and a sense of stewardship over these resources, but also a sense of community. There's a lot of communal ownership of customary tenure systems like the land, the ocean, etc. So I think a large part of this story emerges from the stewardship that the Pacific holds towards the environment and climate change being a core issue that the Pacific often faces. I think it speaks volumes that the youth of the Pacific stood up and like they're bringing this really huge initiative to the global stage. So I think Vanuatu listening to the youth is, I think, the main motivation, but then sort of looking, passing through this a little and looking at the current climate change regime. The Paris Agreement was a momentous occasion in the development of international law around climate change and regulation. But I think one of the things we have to recognize is the severe limitations that it has. The Paris Agreement was a negotiated document, and what this means is you often end up with the lowest common denominator. So a lot of the asks of the Global South were not recognized in the Paris Agreement. There are no strict obligations with the Paris Agreement. A lot of things are, voluntary in nature, and what this means is there's no accountability for states when they're creating their NDCs to respond, in accordance with the amount of emissions they're putting out. So decreasing the emissions corresponding to the amount of emissions they're actually putting out into the world. So I think this failing of states is something that Vanuatu sees as a potential, they see a solution in the ICJ advisory opinion, and what the ICJ advisory opinion can do is clarify international law as it pertains to the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, but also international principles such as due diligence, the polluter pays principle, and then also because it is the International Court of Justice and they have broad competence, you can also invoke different areas of international law, like human rights law, the International Bill of Rights, for example. So there could be an advisory opinion that goes beyond the status quo, the climate change regime, but also strengthening the regime as it currently exists. My role here in New York as the legal advisor to the permanent mission of Vanuatu is to support Ambassador Odo Tevi, who is Vanuatu's special climate envoy on climate change. And he's one of the lead proponents of the ICJ advisory opinion here in New York. And our role is to build on legal strategy, political strategy, getting countries to sign up to this initiative. So when we bring forward our agenda item before the General Assembly, we have the requisite number of supporters that would allow this to go forward. But beyond this, we're not aiming for a simple majority. I think one of the most important things the court looks at when they receive a request for an ICJ advisory opinion is the support that's given in New York at the General Assembly and the states that are voting in favor of it. You will see that a majority of the justices on the bench are predominantly from the global north, mostly white. So we want that to be reflected in the countries that vote in favor of it at the General Assembly. I will talk a little bit about the procedural aspects of the initiative, just to provide some insights into how you can support in the weeks and months going forward. The 77th session began last week. Vanuatu plans to bring the agenda to plenary later this month underneath the agenda item, the report of the ICJ. This will happen on October 27th. So on this day, October 27th, this initiative will formally be introduced in plenary at the General Assembly, and it would be great if you could speak to your leaders, encourage them to provide support to Vanuatu in the General Assembly. This is also the moment when, well, soon after this moment, this will be when the draft resolution becomes publicly available. It will be made available to all UN member states. And this draft will be, it's currently undergoing a consultation process with core group members. So members of the UN who are friends to the ICJ advisory opinion, they're actively inputting into the draft resolution, providing feedback, and we are iterating based on the comments to make this as inclusive as possible. Once this process is complete, that will be the draft resolution that is introduced to the General Assembly. So by that point, there would already be significant input and iterations of the draft resolution. once this happens, and it's officially introduced, we will go into a consultation period where member states, either in plenary or we call this an informal process. So at the UN, it'll undergo a consultation period with member states present where they can actively contribute on the floor to the draft resolution, provide feedback, but also we'll be engaging bilaterally with member states. So this is another period where it would be good for civil society to get engaged and speak to your leaders. One of the things we're seeing often as we meet with countries is advisory opinions is inherently scary to a lot of developed countries. There's a fear that they will be certain liabilities, and maybe this is right. Maybe states have to be fearful because they are the ones contributing, well, certain states contributing the most to global emissions. So we want, going back to my point on like one of the things that's emerging is there's a real push between achieving consensus on the one hand and sending a draft resolution with questions that are ambitious to the International Court of Justice. And some of the development partners we've been meeting with are erring on the side of consensus. And our fear is that if we're aiming for consensus with the draft resolution and the legal questions that go to the International Court of Justice, we won't get the necessary climate action and ambition that we're seeking with something as big as an ICJ advisory opinion on climate change. So perhaps in your talking points, when you're reaching out to your leaders and your government officials, perhaps you could also push them to frame the questions in a way that is ambitious and does move the needle in terms of climate action. I might stop there in case I give away too much, but maybe like the last part of this is after the consultation period, we will be bringing the resolution in its final form to the General Assembly for a vote. And I think this is what everyone's been focused on. This is the moment where we need member states to be on board and supportive of this process. So again, this is like, as Attorney General Keel mentioned, this is likely to happen mid-December to February. So the timeline is not fully hashed out, but it'll be some point in that period. And we look forward to your support. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for providing that background. October 27th, folks, that is also my birthday. A reminder to please contact your leaders, especially as folks here in the Global North, push them to be ambitious and to vote yes on the resolution. Our next speaker is Abby Maxman. As President and CEO of Oxfam America, Abby Maxman seeks to create a future that is equal. She mobilizes people and resources worldwide to make positive social change and to provide life-saving support to people in crisis. Welcome, Abby. From the work of Oxfam, what are some of the human rights implications of climate change that you've witnessed that need to be addressed at the international level, and what are the gaps?
Thank you so much, Salote, and it's just great to be together here with my co-panelists and all of you joining, whether you are virtual or in the room. It's great to be in the room, admittedly, after too long. Today, I will be talking about a combination of things: the devastating effects and costs, human costs of climate change, the failures of government to adequately respond, and how the International Court of Justice can help fill these gaps. First, I really want to spell out the devastating effects of climate change on the world's most vulnerable populations. Last week, I was in Somaliland, visiting Oxfam and our partners' work in the region. And I saw the toxic cocktail of climate, COVID, and conflict in stark relief. This combination of and the impacts of climate change are posing existential threats to people's lives and livelihoods, pastoral livelihoods, people who've developed have evolved over time, their whole history and ancestry and identity under extreme threat. And having spent more than 15 of my more than 30 years living and working in East Africa, I have to say it was deeply dispiriting to see the repeated patterns when the lessons about how to prevent these effects are within our reach. The world has the know-how and the resources to prevent them. The suffering that's caused on people's lives and livelihoods, but also, as this event underscores, how we can turn the trajectory of the climate crisis that is harming people's lives every day. It is deeply troubling to see that we are witnessing a system that is failing the people who are least responsible for causing this crisis. And as Kevin said in his remarks before, talking about the mobilization of youth and activists globally to come to New York right now to hold those in power accountable for using their power and privilege to make a real meaningful change. And I really want to just shout out and applaud those who are sailing for climate justice today as we speak, and the efforts that lead up to Salote's birthday and beyond in the months to come. So I want to tell you about a few people I met in Somaliland. Unfortunately, I tell the story of one, and it's really the story of many. I spoke with a 74-year-old pastoralist man who said he had been displaced. He was in the Durdur internally displaced persons camp, and he shared that in his lifetime, this is the worst drought he has ever experienced. And I spoke to another recent arrival named Sophia. She was a 38-year-old divorced mother of 8. Again, a lot of similarities of the stories. And she had recently arrived at that same Durdur internally displaced persons camp, having lost over 90% of her livestock, her livelihood, but also her identity. And she had stayed in her community as long as she could, as her livestock and life resources slowly eroded year on year of drought, impacting her life. And finally, eventually, her home and community was being circled by hyenas as the remaining livestock were being weakened and dying. And she had no choice but to leave to survive. So there was that literal threat to her life and livelihood, and certainly the global threat, the figurative threat that is being posed to people across East Africa and many other countries around the world. And it is both saddening and angry. It makes me angry that we find ourselves here decades later when the call to make changes, to hold those most responsible for emissions accountable for both providing remedy and policy change to reverse the trajectory that people like Sophia and others are experiencing. Let me go into a little bit more about the numbers, because there's Sophia's story and many others, but they're truly staggering. 90% of household income is being spent on food right now. This is the confluence of events that we're seeing: climate, conflict, COVID, and the downstream implications of those things. We know that there's an imminent threat of famine in East Africa and other places at a scale that we haven't seen in a decade, and highest record numbers of IPC classifications, those that put people on the brink of famine. Those are the classifications that the multilateral system and world has created so that these efforts to use early warning systems and anticipatory action could be triggered in time to prevent people from falling over the edge. But we know that next month, famine is about to be declared. And so this drought is putting pastoralists in an existential crisis. Not only must they find a way to meet their immediate needs, but they have to come to grips with the fact that their way of life and that of their ancestors have followed for generations are ending. Just this week, Oxfam produced a new report called Hunger in a Heating World. And it highlights the growing impact of climate change on the human right to food, not only in Somalia, but globally. We know that hunger has doubled in 10 of the world's worst hotspots over the last 6 years. as more intense and frequent extreme weather events are lending a hard blow to millions of people already reeling from those other C's I mentioned: conflict, the economic shocks of COVID, and rising food prices. We know hunger is more than doubling just in the last 6 years in 10 countries. But then I want to highlight this other point, the climate injustice part of it. The G20 countries are amongst the most polluting nations in the world. I think everyone in this room is aware of that. They are collectively responsible for nearly 77% of carbon emissions, which dwarfs the emissions from those 10 countries, the 10 who are at the bottom, whose lives and livelihoods are at threat. They are responsible for 0.013% of those emissions, and yet they are experiencing the worst, the pointy end of what is happening. And so we really must stop this injustice, and Chair, urge G20 leaders to cut their emissions and compensate these countries and who are on the bottom end, if you will, of what's happening. There's numbers continue, 18 million people in 10 countries on the brink of starvation, and going to the Pacific Island countries where also livelihoods are under threat. A 50% decline in the maximum fish catch potential is expected by the year 2100. So we have from pastoralist communities in East Africa to fishing communities in the Pacific Islands, all experiencing similar reverberations of what is happening, and they're the least responsible for the causes. So given that Pacific Islanders rely on fish for up to 90% of their annual animal protein, the dire situation is leading to severe food insecurity there. So the links of hunger and climate are obvious and part of what we're talking about here. These are gross human rights violations that people are experiencing every day. And they're further exacerbating the inequalities that people are already subjected to as they try to realize their rights and their agency. I want to pivot now to the government failures, accountabilities, and responsibilities. We know climate change has a direct impact on people's lives, but it also limits the ability of countries to respond and reduces available resources. And the estimated projected economic costs of loss and damage in developing countries could increase to between $290 billion and $580 billion per year just by 2030. Those are staggering numbers on countries that are already weighted under debt and do not have the resources that they need. And states are required to take steps to refrain from harming human rights of any person, and similarly prevent corporations within their jurisdiction from harming any person's rights. Now, United Nations committees of experts that interpret international human rights treaties have clarified that states must prevent foreseeable human rights harm caused by climate change and regulate activities contributing to this harm. And if they fail to do so, that is a human rights violation. So again, the confluence of events and the impact on human rights. And in spite of all this, we do not see states taking these obligations seriously, particularly those most responsible, as we heard in the video, and I think it's a recurring theme of today. Rich and industrialized countries have contributed more than 92% of excess historical emissions and 30% of current emissions, but are not taking adequate steps to meet their human rights obligations. And concurrently, the climate pledges, these are just the pledges. These are not pledges fulfilled, but pledges made, would lead to the global temperature increase of 2.7% Celsius. So around the world, we continue to see richer nations failing to take pledges that reflect their responsibility and obligations. And if they were serious, to give some examples, they would be taking every feasible step to replace fossil fuel use and extraction with renewable energy, and to reduce the consumption of energy efficient measures. So we are seeing the combination failure of government, the human rights violations, and the damages and lack of repair offered by richer countries. And we're hoping that this week at events like today, and as we go into the G20 and beyond, that those in power and will start to honor commitments and live up to the changes and realities of our time. I have to say, it's truly extraordinary that as humanity faces this existential crisis, there is still more incentive by fossil fuel companies and governments in rich countries to destroy our planet than to save it and save lives. So how the ICJ can help fill these gaps? And it already, the video called it out, and Kevin as well. And I know all of the fellow panelists will be talking more about it, but I do want to touch on that too. By requesting the ICJ advisory opinion, governments can elevate the debate about human rights obligations and climate change and show that at least a majority, which isn't enough, we want it to be more, of UN members want human rights to be taken seriously in addressing the climate crisis. The ICJ can provide the first opinion by a court that has a global remit to set out to governments what their legal obligations are so that civil society and all members of society can hold their governments account to take action. Now, thus far, only a few of these countries are being held accountable by their own courts for climate change. Netherlands and Germany are two examples, each of which has been required by their governments to make significant, although insufficient, change to and emissions reductions, but the courts are focused more on climate harms in their own countries, not in the Pacific Islands, not globally, and on those who are experiencing the disproportionate impact most. So an ICJ advisory opinion would address human rights faced by people across the world, and the decision would apply to every government in the world, and that can help us hold our policymakers accountable to take action and make a real change. So in sum, we know that climate change has devastating consequences for the most marginalized people on the planet. Rich governments are responsible, but they're not recognizing and acting under their obligations of international law to prevent these human rights violations and to provide remedy for all of them. And our hope is that the ICJ can provide the first opinion by a court that has a global remit to set out the legal obligations for these governments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abby, for sharing your experiences about the work that Oxfam does and the communities that are facing climate crisis, and for also reminding us that communities face multiple threats. Like Abby mentioned, in Somaliland, it's not just climate change, it's also COVID and conflict, multiple crises that many of the communities also in the Pacific and around the world are facing. I'd like now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Maria Antonia Tigre, who is currently a Global Climate Litigation Fellow at the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. Dr. Tigre is also the Deputy Director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment, where she works with scholars and practitioners in the region to study the interface between human rights and the environment. Welcome, Dr. Maria Tigres. What is the importance of the campaign for a right to a healthy environment, and how does it relate to the ICJ advisory opinion campaign?
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. It's really a huge pleasure and a privilege for me to be here and to share a little bit of my work and my knowledge with and how it intersects with this campaign. It's been really a big pleasure to follow it from its incipience to where it is now, and to see how powerful some people can actually be in raising their voices and actually bringing their concerns to the highest level, policy level that exists around the world, right? I have been studying the right to a healthy environment for several years, and that led me to where I am now at the Sabin Center, focusing on global climate litigation. So a huge part of my work right now is actually tracking and following cases at the global level and seeing sort of big trends and how, sort of what are the laws that are coming out of it. which is a huge endeavor and a really big privilege as well to sort of track that and follow and see how many, nowadays there are over 500 cases around the world of, citizens like the Pacific Students, NGOs, bringing their governments or corporations to account for their mitigation and adaptation commitments and their responsibilities. So obviously the advisory opinion that is being sought now adds to that. And it's really the most exciting thing that's happening in global climate litigation now, and really bring some of these questions that have been sought at the national level and at the regional level to the international level. And brings this opportunity for the highest court in the world to actually weigh an opinion on that. So I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of that general trend of global climate litigation, and obviously the question that I was asked to answer here and how that intersects with the campaign to recognize a right to a healthy environment at international level, which was the topic of my PhD thesis. So it's something that I followed for several years through many sort of twists and turns and disappointments at times, and obviously the work of too many people, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to a Healthy Environment, the one who has an appointment now, David Boyd, and John Knox, who was there before him, and so many people campaigning at the international level and going back to their governments as well to sort of make that a reality, right? So, how the Attorney General alluded to that, obviously last year, the Human Rights Council recognized the right to a healthy environment, and then earlier this year, the General Assembly made that same recognition, and really it was obviously a huge achievement, very late, something that a lot of stakeholders have been campaigning for several years, and scholars have written for decades about the right to a healthy environment and how that already existed, obviously in over 150 constitutions around the world. So several states had already recognized that at the national level, but then it was obviously a huge achievement to actually get to the international level and make that recognition as well. It was passed really by an overwhelming majority, a lot more than people expected. And I think that's very significant for this advisory opinion for multiple reasons. I think, first of all, that it shows that states may actually be ready to consider the question that is being posed now on the responsibility of states related to climate change. And obviously are paying more attention to environmental damage and climate change around the world. I think it's obviously in the news all the time, and it's affecting countries, the global north and the global south. So if that's what it's needed to actually bring that to their attention, it is what it is, right? So it's having that effect on other countries as well. It's important too. So I think, having that recognition and makes the climate change discussion really clear that it is a human rights issue. If there still was any question about that. There has obviously been several studies and, seen by so many of the effects of the human rights effects, like were mentioned already here today on climate change, it's very significant, having the effects on food, on water, on so many human rights that were previously recognized, obviously on the right to life, on cultural and traditional knowledge as well. But having that recognition of the right to a healthy environment really brings it to another level, and makes it brings the environment to the discussion of human rights and to the laws of human rights, so that it can actually be considered under that realm. So it's the discussion of whether international environmental law and human rights are separate issues is no longer there. So that recognition makes those two sort of separate fields of law be united and can be considered together. So I think for that reason, it's very significant that, before we reach the point of having this advisory opinion considered by the ICJ, having that recognition of the right to a healthy environment at the international level is important. Bringing it back a little bit to the climate litigation piece of it, there have been several courts around the world that have recognized responsibilities of states to mitigate and adapt to climate change based on human rights, and including the rights to a healthy environment. And I wanted to mention, I'm from Brazil, maybe I should have said that before, but I think I wanted to mention a little bit about sort of what's happening in my part of the world in terms of climate litigation, and that the legal recognition of human rights in the environment, because I think it's always important to have that comparative piece of it and see what we can actually learn from other jurisdictions, which is a lot of sort of the trend of climate litigation right now. States and stakeholders see what's been successful in one part of the world and then try to replicate that to somewhere else and see if similar results could be achieved. So in 2017, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued an advisory opinion as well, it's being attempted right now at the ICJ on human rights in the environment. So the right to a healthy environment, something that was not recognized by the American Convention, which is sort of the convention that they were assessing. But the Inter-American Court actually recognized that right to a healthy environment as part of that realm of human rights that was adopted and assessed by the American Convention in extension based on different interpretations. And so that was a recognition made by the court, and in that advisory opinion as well, specifically analyze the extraterritorial responsibilities of states for environmental damage. So really saying that there is an extraterritorial responsibility and that states have obligations based on that right to a healthy environment, but also on other human rights, as well as on international environmental principles and customary international law. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from that advisory opinion. It was very progressive, and it was the first time that extraterritorial responsibility was actually acknowledged in such a way for environmental damage, and obviously that applies to climate change as well. And I think it's really sort of the root of what that north-south dimension on climate responsibility can actually come from. A lot of the vast majority of the cases that we have right now in climate litigation are trying to get their own governments accountable. There have been attempts at the Committee on the Rights of the Child, so with other bodies as well. But obviously, this is the first time that big question on state responsibility is actually going to be asked. And I think that north-south dimension and the responsibility towards, obviously, island states and developing countries is very important. And just to sort of finalize to see how that type of advisory opinion, like was issued by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, can actually have an impact at the national level. Like I said, I'm from Brazil. I think everybody knows that Brazil has the Amazon rainforest, which is really important for the whole world in terms of climate mitigation, which has not been very well protected, especially in the past couple of years. And it's a country that has really had a lot of backlash in terms of the environmental obligations and climate change commitments that the country has made. So it used to be sort of in the right track, and now it isn't anymore. So there was a very important case that was brought to the Brazilian Supreme Court, basically challenging the lack of enforcement of commitment that the country had made towards having a climate fund and having that the funds that were available be enforced at the national level. That case was brought directly to the Supreme Court. And a couple of months ago, the Supreme Court, based on the right to a healthy environment at the constitutional level, and then alluding to that advisory opinion as well, said for the first time in the world, as far as we're concerned, that the Paris Agreement is a human rights treaty. So really bringing that those commitments of the Paris Agreement and those climate obligations, international obligations, to the realm of human rights, and really enforcing towards that interpretation and that perspective. That's very significant, obviously, for multiple reasons, but I think in practice, what that means is that the obligation to mitigate, which is part of the Paris Agreement, is a human rights obligation. And I think that's something that, bringing that sort of comparative perspective, which is really the core of my work nowadays, how that we can make that interpretation applicable to other jurisdictions as well. So, just wanted to share a little bit of that to see sort of the importance of having that human right and having that recognition of the right to a healthy environment, how that can actually have an impact in terms of that sort of enforcement of mitigation obligations that the country can have. I'm happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, but really wanted really to commend you all for doing this, and thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tigray. It's such an important piece of work, and we're so appreciative of all the work that you do. And we were on a panel earlier this morning, and an Indigenous leader reminded us that without this planet, there is no us. So knowledge that is somewhat not even unique, actually, for a lot of communities is I think, reflected in this right to a healthy environment. So thank you for sharing that. Our last, but certainly not least speaker is Vishal Prasad. Vishal is a campaigner with the Pacific Island Students Fighting Climate Change, who has been working on the campaign to seek an ICJ advisory opinion for the last 3 years. Vishal is from Fiji, and he is passionate about climate activism and human rights. Bula vinaka, Vishal, and welcome. Why are youth and civil society all across the world calling for an ICJ advisory opinion?
Thank you, Salote, for that, and very good afternoon to everyone. Also very warm Bula vinaka and namaste to you all. It really is a great pleasure to be here speaking to you all today. And seeing you all here against the backdrop of the milestones that the campaign has achieved so far, and that is truly humbling to notice and witness. And for that, and from the very outset, I'd like to thank you for your support. My part in this has been to discuss why young people and why civil society have been supporting a campaign for an ICJ-AO. This campaign began in the Pacific by students, by youth, and has been led by youth, and is now part of an alliance of global CSOs. To give a very simple answer to why youth are taking this campaign on, it's to protect the future. For years, we have known that the reality of climate change, seen the impacts it brings, and have known the necessary steps we need to take in order to avoid the path of catastrophe. But as simple as it may sound, we all know global action has been significantly lacking, and our futures are severely under jeopardy as a result of this. The ICJ-AO campaign was born out of this sense of urgency, and that was fueled, and that has fueled the initial 27 students to reach out to our governments, and it is still the fuel that keeps us going and has now led to others joining the journey as well. I say journey here because for us, this campaign recalls the great journeys Pacific Islanders have made in the past and is now embarking once again in search for greater climate justice at the world's highest court. So through this, we hope to see the advisory opinion respond to the lack by catalyzing greater action to break the deadlock that we face year in and year out, and help strengthen the Paris Agreement to become the robust agreement it can be with the necessary legal clarification and support. This sense of urgency, coupled with really frustration on our part on what has been happening, has underpinned the civil society and youth campaign. But it's not just emotion that is behind this campaign. It is also the potential of an advisory opinion from the ICJ in effecting change that is also behind why we're supporting this. We are campaigning for an advisory opinion that seeks to bring together human rights, impacts of climate change on future and current generations as well. This is the heart of the Youth and CSO campaign in calling for the ICJ to clarify what state obligations are in protecting these threatened rights and and that is what civil society and youth would like to see in the legal question that will be voted upon later this year. By possessing a human rights lens to addressing climate change, we are putting lived realities to the center of our responses. Human rights obligations also provide the legal basis to compel stronger and more rapid action by governments. They highlight the moral high ground we stand on, and it is a forward-looking approach that focuses on the future and avoids naming and shaming, and therefore is more likely to gather support, and human rights also have more potential due to being inalienable. And it is not just the human rights dimension of this campaign that that explains youth support, but also the idea of intergenerational equity that is attached to this campaign. We are not just fighting for the rights of people now, but for those who come after us in a bid to ensure that this planet remains habitable and a kind home for many to come after us. And a lot of focus is now being put on this idea of intergenerational justice, especially with the Future Summit announcement. And this ties in well with our campaign for an advisory opinion. An advisory opinion also through this lens will help cement the scientific consensus on climate change, encourage ambitious action under the Paris Agreement, provide baselines for action, and integrate international environmental law with human rights law, and provide guidance for adjudications at all levels. This framing has allowed the campaign to be very accommodating of various youth asks and demands relating to climate action. An ICJ advisory opinion clarifying at minimum what states need to do will also strengthen the work of activists everywhere and would provide and empower civil society organizations, climate activists with a potent tool to combat environmental injustices worldwide. Having the security of a clarified legal position would mean new and stronger forms of actions that activists can lead, resulting in the protection of the environment, pollution control becoming serious considerations and action points for states. Not only would the ICJ be a legal circuit breaker for global negotiations, but it would also be a major confidence booster for the work of activists all over. Perhaps no better example of this would be the Alliance for a Climate Justice Advisory Opinion, which is a congregation of more than 1,500 CSOs from around the world, which have come together to work strongly and actively on the advisory opinion campaign. Finally, we all agree that climate change is a whole of society issue, and as a result, there must be a whole of society response to it. International law and our courts must also be brought in to respond to the crisis at hand. As we juncture into the critical decade of action, we need an all hands on deck approach because the storm we are in demands this. But this is not all doom and gloom. And I think this is another reason why we're supporting the campaign. While not a silver bullet, the ICJ-AO does bring hope because it is a specific campaign with a very precise call to action that has the potential to bring meaningful and tangible results. Our colleagues at the World's Youth for Climate Justice describe ourselves as stubborn optimists. And in truth, amidst all that is happening around us, we choose to retain our stubborn optimism that through an ICJ advisory opinion, we can be a lot closer to responding to the climate crisis. And that is why we're here today, and that is why we will continue to champion this cause. Thank you, and Vinaka.
Thank you so much, Vishal. The reason is actually pretty simple and clear: to protect their future and the future generations. And as a mom, and I'm sure there's folks in the room who have little ones at home, you might be feeling inspired and empowered to join this campaign and to support the Pacific Island students fighting for climate change as much as I am. So please join me in giving our panelists another round of applause. Thank you so much. I'd like now to invite the panelists to come and take a seat up front for questions. There is one question in our virtual space, but I'd like to give an opportunity first to folks joining us in the room. If you have any questions, to please raise your hand and we'll give you a mic. You're also amazing, by the way. I could not process a lot of the things that were mentioned, so there's a question at the back. Can I take that? Richard. Thank you so much. She's sitting at the back.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I'm a youth delegate from Sudan, and I just want to know, I care, of course, about Pacific Island, and I hear that early this year, some countries, including one of the Pacific Island, have declared an emergency, climate change emergency. So what does that mean? I'm sorry. And how can I help as a youth from a different country, but also suffer from climate change in a different way?
Thank you for that question. I think maybe briefly I could just go first and say, climate emergencies, a lot of Pacific Island countries are now declaring climate emergencies. Fiji has that in part of its climate act that's come out last year. And it really is just to sound the alarm that what is happening is an emergency back home. And what we're doing here, an advisory opinion, is a response to that. We're looking at new options in order to bolster action, really. And so as a young person and anyone listening, what we can do is really get our governments to, one thing we can do is get our governments to support this campaign. It will be up for a vote. There is a specific call to action for governments. And if we can get all the leaders of the world to vote yes, that is a great way to move this campaign forward and get us closer, as I said, to potentially addressing the climate crisis with progressing the advisory opinion campaign. And so as a young person, you could support our campaign as Pacific Island students and the World's Youth for Climate Justice. There are tools available online, petitions that we're making to our leaders, letters you can write, ways, a whole host of things we can do in order to get your voices heard to the leaders so that they can vote yes on the resolution later on.
Thank you, Vishal.
Thank you. My question is to Dr. Maria Antoinette. It's very interesting to hear what you said. I was wondering if you can say something about, you mentioned about something about the number of cases going on. I was wondering if you could say something about the parties, who are the parties in the tribunals that are involved, whether it's domestic jurisdiction, it's not jurisdiction, no, something about that. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for your question. So we have the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School, where I work. We have a global database of climate litigation cases. There's a separate database for US cases. The US has, I think now the number, maybe it's over 1,300 cases. It's really a lot more. Climate litigation started a lot sooner than in the rest of the world. So it's sort of, it's a lot different from the rest of the world. But I track the global piece of it, which now has over 500 cases. I think it's about 570 now, if I'm not mistaken. There are, I think, over 54 jurisdictions, I think, over which we track, and that includes some regional and international tribunals as well, and also some arbitration tribunals too. So we do include some investment stage arbitration cases as well. So the vast majority of cases are actually at the national level, is in the national courts, and they are brought usually by either citizens or a group of citizens or NGOs against either states or corporations. So there are two, the majority are against states, but there are some increasing cases against corporations as well. And it really, it's pretty vast, sort of what they cover. There are some of the most sort of famous cases that are brought against countries, asking them to, so the national governments to reduce emissions and to commit more to sort of the percentage of emission reductions and the commitments under the Paris Agreement. So, the case in the Netherlands, which is very famous, the one in Germany, which is similar, and sort of Italy, there are several sort of that framework type of cases. But there are also like a lot of different types of cases as well. And a lot of cases question specific projects, which also, contribute obviously to reducing emissions overall. And then now there are several cases against corporations too, like the decision that happened that the court in the Netherlands reached against the case against Shell, which also said that Shell had as a corporation also had a commitment under the Paris Agreement to reduce emissions. So it's really vast, and we do write a report for the UN Environment Program on global climate litigation. There was one in 2017 and one in 2020. There's another one that we're finalizing that will come out at the end of the year or beginning of next year, which sort of covers sort of everything.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tigre. Do you have any other questions from the audience?
Thank you. I'm from Fiji. Listening to what you said, you need an urgency to take it to the higher court, but I really commended about it. From myself, I came from very remote Pacific Islands, right in Laos. And what I experienced after 16 years, I went back there, it's half of our coastal. It's been eroded so fast. To my point, how urgent, if they say yes tomorrow, or what time they'll say yes to UN, how long are you going to solve our problems? Because most of the remote islands are quickly sinking like Tuvalu. If we wait for another 5 or 6 years, I don't know, we were all right on top of the sea. That's where I come from. How urgency, as one of I experienced from my island, a very dramatic hurricane had been striking us, and the coastal boundaries have been eroded so fast. How can you help us? Thank you very much.
Naka. Kevin, would you like to respond to that in terms of the timeline of the process?
Does this work? Testing.
I think it's already on.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, no, so I think in terms of timeline, in terms of timeline, once the General Assembly votes for the resolution and it passes, shortly thereafter, it's transmitted by the Secretary General to the International Court of Justice, and then proceedings begin. This case seems like there will be, because this is such a big global issue, there'll be quite a lot of interest from numerous states. So there's the likelihood that it will be quite maybe a year or two. It could vary. But having said that, the impacts of climate change, they're here, they're upon us. There's just not one silver bullet that would solve it. I think several folks have mentioned that Vanuatu has taken on several other initiatives that work in parallel. One is ecocide, amending the Rome statutes to list ecocide as a criminal offense under the Rome statutes. And this is one way to address like the wanton destruction of the environment. Beyond that, there are other initiatives that are going on to bring similar cases, like the ITLOS case. That's something that is proposed by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu. They've created a commission of small island states, which has the mandate to request an advisory opinion from ITLOS. And this is something that perhaps could speak a little to your issues of eroding coastlines. What are the legal consequences of this under the law of the Sea Convention? But there are a host of other solutions at play. I'm sorry, I don't have a very clear answer for you. Litigation takes a while, and perhaps one of the outcomes of this can be, I don't want to say restitution, but something along the line. Maybe not from the ICJ, but in subsequent fora. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Abby, perhaps a question for you then, building on Fani's question is, Vishal mentioned that, at the heart of the campaign is centering lived experiences, centering human rights. In the likelihood or hopeful likelihood that we'll get this advisory opinion from the ICJ in say perhaps 2 years, as Kevin has mentioned, what does a human rights centered approach in rolling out the advisory opinion look like from Oxfam's experience?
Yeah, thanks. What's that? Any better? Yeah. I'll talk louder, see if that helps. Well, it really speaks also to your question, because the question of urgency, it can feel very frustrating, despite the vital importance of a justice-focused approach, but in terms of how long this can take. And your description of 16 years of the coastline eroding and small islands being underwater, that's not good enough. And so a rights-based approach will be a collective kind of combination, movements of civil society holding governments and the private sector account, even while the courts and the systems are trying to work through to take action every day. And because people are suffering now. And as we know, there's no planet B, and we cannot come back to something else as each day, each year. And as we look back at the movement over the past quarter of a century, in my own work, it is really frustrating to see the pace of change. And certainly there's accountabilities and actions being taken, but people's lives and livelihoods are struggling right now. And it's not just about the financial and lives and livelihoods, it's about dignity and rights in crisis. And so we need to make sure that we're raising our voices on behalf of those whose voices are not being heard, so that their stories can be told and that they are getting the remedy they deserve. Governments and everywhere, those who are responsible for climate change, but also national and local level, are helping those whose voices are not being heard. And we know that those are the ones that we have a responsibility through movements and collective action to lift their voices and to hold all account. There's plenty that can be done. Certainly fossil fuel companies that are reaping, unbelievable profits at the moment. If we just look at some of the UN appeals while we're here in New York this week, the humanitarian appeal global package is $49 billion at the moment. Fossil fuel companies' profits, that would represent 18 days of their profits to provide that amount of resource to address the global humanitarian appeal needs at this moment in time. We really have to use moments like this in New York to hold everyone accountable and say that's not good enough. We cannot have corporations and fossil fuel companies lining their pockets while those who are not responsible are suffering most. And then governments saying there's no money. There is money. The resources are there and the people are there, and we can act.
Thank you so much, Abby. Folks, it is after 2. I apologize, but I would have to end our discussion here and let our tech folks round up their work. Thank you all so much to our esteemed panelists. Thank you so much to the Pacific Island students fighting climate change. Thank you so much to Mr. Attorney General of Honorable Loftman. Thank you all for sitting here and for being so engaged. We're so happy. As I mentioned before, the VACA is a canoe. So we invite you all to jump on the canoe and sail to the ICJ and take this advisory opinion and get it done. So with that invitation, please join me in giving a round of applause to our audience, again, to our panelists, and to you all. Thank you. There's refreshments at the back, so please help yourselves. To all our virtual audience, Binaka Wakalebu will be sending out a recording after this. Binaka.